Syria, Syria, don't cry! Syria, Syria, don't cry! We will never let you die! We will never let you die!
I'm speaking again with Dr. Joseph Donner. He's Swiss Syrian. He hosts the blog Syria Freedom Forever and writes about the Syrian Revolution. He writes a column for peacenews.org and was recently interviewed with Patrick Coburn on The Real News. He's presently in Geneva, Switzerland. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation.
So there's campaigns on Facebook. It's called Aleppo is Burning. A lot of people have turned their Facebook identity, I forget what they call that, their picture, to a solid red. So what's going on in Aleppo?
The situation in Aleppo is catastrophic. It has, for the past week, 8 days, been suffering of heavy bombings of Assad regime planes, mostly, bombing civilian infrastructures, such as hospitals and other similar civilian institutions, while in the same time, we had some armed opposition groups bombing, shelling as well, civilians in territories under the control of the Assad regime. So on both sides, this should be condemned, even though it's not on the same scale. And obviously, the bombing of Assad's regime plane has been much heavier. And we have to take into account as well that the region under the control of the opposition has been suffering from barrel bombs and other forms of bombing by the Assad regime for more than 3 years now. So the situation in Aleppo is only worsening, unfortunately, every day.
Now, for those of our viewers who are not familiar with the geography, so Aleppo is the biggest city in Syria, is that right?
It's the second most important city in Syria. It was actually, before the revolution, nearly between 4 to 5 million people. And it was an industrial center of Syria, and the second most important economic center of the country after Damascus.
And how many people, in your estimate, are living in Aleppo now, in the liberated areas or in the whole area?
So in the liberated areas, it's around 300,000 people, estimated by various opposition groups and organizations, while on the regime's controlled areas, we have more than 1.5 million people living in these areas.
And is there also Nusra areas and ISIS areas?
So actually, Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, was kicked out from the liberated areas of Aleppo in 2013, beginning of 2014, by various opposition groups, Free Syrian Army, demonstrations from revolutionaries on the ground in Aleppo. So Islamic State is not at all present in the liberated areas of the city of Aleppo, but in areas of the countryside of Aleppo, where various groups of the Free Syrian Army are combating it. While for Jabhat al-Nusra, they've been also kicked out from these areas in the past few months, and you have on various occasions demonstrations against Jabhat al-Nusra from people of the liberated areas of Aleppo. We have to take into account that these liberated areas in Aleppo and other as well region of Syria represent a democratic alternative to the dictatorship of the Assad regime and to the authoritarianism of Islamic fundamentalist forces. So when Assad regime is bombing these areas, it's not only about putting an end militarily to the opposition, to the armed opposition presence, but it also putting an end to any possible democratic and popular alternative to the Assad regime and to the Islamic fundamentalist forces. And this is the biggest threat of the dictatorship of the Assad. And this has been the case since day one.
In the U.S., there's been some concern about Obama sending more troops in to fight ISIS, a very small number of troops, I don't know, maybe 250. But what the Russians are doing is certainly much, much bigger in their intervention. Is that right?
Definitely. First of all, the Russian intervention has been going on in Syria nearly since the beginning of the revolution, through the presence of Russian soldiers or Russian military personnel advising the Assad regime in its war against the Syrian people. And we reached a new level in October 2015 with the massive military intervention of Russian airplanes, Russian also presence on the field, combating alongside Assad forces and Hezbollah and Iranian also supported sectarian Shia fundamentalist forces. And it has been a key player in changing the situation on the ground in the favor of the Assad regime. Basically, Russian intervention in Syria, especially from October 2015, was made in the perspective of saving the Assad regime that was crumbling from inside, whether militarily, politically, economically.
And when the Palmyra was taken from ISIS, we was remarkable. There was a report, I think, in the Telegraph and the British paper, and you didn't see any Arab troops. It was all Russian special forces and Shia from Afghanistan. It was extraordinary.
The army of the Assad regime has completely crumbled since the beginning of the revolution. And was before the revolution, we have estimates that the number of soldiers were around 300,000, and it reached today between 60 to 80,000 people, soldiers that are not mostly combating on the front line, but mostly in cities, trying to prevent any kind of taking care of security. Most of the fighting on the ground is by a minority of soldiers of the Assad regime, but mostly Hezbollah, the Lebanese Islamic fundamentalist group, sectarian Shia militias supported by Iran from Iraq, and also, unfortunately, Afghan refugees that are very impoverished and are sent by Iran where they are refugees. And Iran obviously have generals on the ground advising, and you had a lot of reports showing the amount of death among Iranian generals. So yeah, obviously you don't have a true army, a Syrian army combating the various opposition forces, without forgetting obviously the role of Russia as well.
Before we talk about what we should be demanding and doing here, I wanted to just briefly ask about this interview you did on The Real News. You were speaking, it wasn't exactly a debate, but you and Patrick Coburn were having you were saying quite different things. And one thing in particular was about the hospital, where the hospital that, let's say, 55 people got killed, the last pediatrician in the liberated area of Aleppo, and so on. And Coburn was saying, well, I don't know, they just indiscriminately shoot. And I don't think you got a chance to answer that exactly. So what would you say about that hospital and so on?
I believe, and you're right, there's quite some differences between me and Patrick Coburn. I believe that no, the strategy of the regime since day one in the revolution has been to prevent any kind of a dual power on the ground. In other words, a democratic alternative, implementing an alternative society to the institutions of the regime. And by targeting hospitals, but all other civilian infrastructures, the regime is targeting any possibility of a society that is able to live in Syria, not under the occupation of the Assad regime. So this is why the Assad regime has been targeting hospitals in Aleppo, but other civilian infrastructures as well, but in other areas as well. You had, for example, some civilian infrastructures also being the target of Assad warplanes and Russian warplanes as well in the countryside of Aleppo, in Idlib, and other areas of Syria. So the strategy is very clear: to prevent any kind of institutions alternative to the Assad regime, and to push population out of these areas, of liberated areas, to prevent them of organizing. by themselves.
All right, so now we come to, what should the left, the people who believe in human rights in Syria, what should we be saying? Do we picket the Russian embassy? Do we demand things from the U.S. government? What are the things that could be helpful?
There are many things that I think then can be helpful. First of all, on a direct perspective today, it's participating in the international campaign in solidarity with Aleppo under the title Aleppo Burning. So organizing demonstration in solidarity with Aleppo against the killing of all civilians, against the bombardments of the regime, Assad warplanes, but against also the shelling of civilians in regime territories. We have to oppose all of this. We have to oppose, obviously, the continuation of the Russian military intervention in Syria that did not stop at all. And the so-called withdrawal of Russia is a complete lie. Actually, the numbers of Russian soldiers did not decrease considerably. There's still 5,000 Russian military personnel within Syria. And the campaign of bombing various areas of Syria have continued. Last example was Palmyra, but you have other areas also of Syria that have witnessed bombing of Russia. So therefore, obviously, as a leftist, we oppose any kind of imperialist intervention. And this includes, obviously, Russia, which is a capitalist and imperialist state, not only in Syria, but we can see it as well in Ukraine or the way they dealt with the Chechnya issue. Also, we should obviously oppose the intervention of regional imperialist powers alongside the Assad regime, such as Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, that has been increasingly playing a sub-imperialist role in the region, whether in Syria or in Iraq and Lebanon, Yemen, etc. So therefore, we oppose it, obviously, just as the intervention of Hezbollah. In the same time, we should oppose as well other interventions coming from, for example, the so-called friends of Syria that are not at all friends of Syria, such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar, that are only being proposed. We should ask the delivery of weapons only without any kind of political conditions, but to the political groups such within the Free Syrian Army with a democratic political programs that exist indeed. Plus the Turkish intervention against the bombing of Kurdish areas should be opposed as well. So this, I think, and first of all, as leftists and progressive, put our energy in supporting the Democrats within Syria, supporting the local popular councils. They are the future of Syria. They are the ones that will enable Syria to be democratic, to support Syria for all without any kind of differences or discriminations regarding ethnicity, gender, religion. So our main objective should be supporting these democratic councils on the ground, still working, especially in Aleppo, but in other areas as well. And this means also demanding that a complete truce, meaning no violation of the truce, should be implementing on the ground. And this means pressuring, again, Russia and Iran, that are the main actors, enabling the Assad regime to continue its war against the Syrian people. So we have a broad objective when it comes to the left. And if I may add, sorry.
If I may, what about the sieges? Is it a reasonable thing to say, the UN should be demanding an end to the sieges? There should be airdrops of food right now.
Obviously, I believe this is a complete legitimate demand, that all siege should be lifted and that the UN should be able to deliver whatever is needed by the local population. I believe totally legitimate demand, but as you know very well, Stan, the UN is only implementing what the great powers want, and without the Russian veto, it's impossible to implement this kind of decision. But obviously, leftists and progressives should have this kind of demands, obviously, to alleviate
So then what
the
about
suffering
what
of
about
civilians. This is one of the most important things that we should do.
so if the UN wouldn't do it, we can demand the US do it by itself. Is that
Obviously,
reasonable?
I think and it's politically very intelligent to do it, not only about bringing and providing needed humanitarian assistance to civilians on the ground, and this everything that can help the civilians on the ground, especially delivering food and other necessities, should be supported by also showing the lies and the contradiction of the USA that have been covering Russian campaign against the opposition, because the US has been pushing the opposition to accept any kind of conciliatory demands to the Assad regime. The US wants an end to this revolution. It wants an end of all the opposition on the ground. It wants the structure of the regime to stay. And this means putting an end to any kind of popular resistance on the ground.
We should emphasize this, because there's there's a trend in the U.S. I'm starting to call them the pro-fascist left that keeps saying again and again, Obama's trying to destroy Assad and all this, but you're saying the opposite, that they just want this all over with. Is that right?
If you check the internal discussion within the White House since the beginning of the revolution, not at a single time a change of regime in Syria was mentioned or pushed forward. It has been very clear since day one that the US don't want regime change in Syria. And I remind everyone that in the first few weeks of the revolutionary process in Syria, at the beginning of the popular uprising, Hillary Clinton said that Bashar al-Assad was a reformist. And in the first peace talks in the Geneva conference in 2012, the future of Bashar al-Assad was not mentioned. We can see it for the past few weeks. The US, although rhetorically denouncing the campaigns of Russian bombardments or Assad regime bombardments on civilians, on opposition territories, has done nothing to change the behavior, concretely speaking. So not at all that we can say the US has been willing for regime change in Syria. Quite on the opposite. And this is why they've been vetoing as well the provision of weapons to opposition, to various opposition forces in Syria. So no, not at all. We can see that there's a will of the US to regime change in Syria. Quite on the opposite.
Well, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you to you, Stan.
We'll talk again. This has been Stanley Heller for The Struggle.